This is a bit of a random video for me, but one that I wanted to make. Actually, as a response to a different video, Snoman Gaming recently put out a video titled Bad Game Design NES Games, where he goes into detail as to why he finds NES games so poorly designed. I so strongly disagree with this, I decided I'd rather make a video about it than commenting, as it could be an interesting watch. But before I do that, please don't send hate his way. I actually generally enjoy his videos, and I'm actually subscribed to him. He has some great discussion on design in his game design series, and his recent one on the Messenger I recommend. That said, let's discuss the brilliance of NES game design. This is structured as a rebuke to his video, so I'll be mentioning things he's stated, so just keep that in mind. We're going to start with the very first level of Super Mario Bros., which is the very first platform game, so bear it in mind as it would be what many platform games base themselves off of. Super Mario Bros. Has a famous first stage, not just because it was Super Mario, but because of how well designed it is. Off the bat, you learn Goombas hurt you have limited lives, and you learn hitting blocks gives you items, which you're likely to hit because of the giant question mark meant to entice you. Collecting coins feels good, and getting enough gives you an extra life. A mushroom is a power-up and shown to you right at the start. Other power-ups appear in this level as well. Not only this, but so do multiple types of secrets, teaching you there will be secrets in the game, which will give you extremely helpful items like 1-ups, power-ups, or extra coins. Alright, remember that as we go forward.
Well, you ran out of lives. Sorry, guess you gotta start the whole game over now. Lives are the bane of my existence. Their sole purpose is to push back your progress as punishment for losing them. And I think this is the main reason people say that NES games were so hard. But this, my friends, is what we call artificial difficulty. It's not hard because it tests your skill to get past a certain hurdle. It's hard because it removes your resources so that you can't attempt the hurdle as often as you'd like.
Okay, I guess I have to discuss the design purpose of lives. Going back to Mario for a moment, Mario gives you a set number of lives and a set number of continues. For losing all of these and doing poorly at the game, you're punished for it. Lose all of your lives and you have to use a continue. Use all your continues and you lose the game. So there's a number of reasons for this, and it isn't artificial difficulty. For one, the challenge of some of these games was, how far can you go given how many lives you have? That's the challenge. That's part of the game. You don't have to enjoy this, but it's not built to specifically make the game difficult. That is the game. But there's another major element to it that actually factors into why it can actually be a really good game design element when implemented properly, which many NES games did. For example, in Super Mario Bros., you can find hidden 1-up mushrooms, which are extremely rewarding to find. In later installments of the Mario series, when the games got far easier, you can so easily rack up lives that the 1-ups are kind of a joke and they don't feel special anymore. The item no longer matters. This is especially evident in Super Mario Maker. Now, I love Super Mario Maker. The game lets you create your own Mario levels and lets other people play them online. I enjoyed making levels, I enjoyed playing other people's levels, but there's something you quickly discover. While you can put secrets in your levels and include 1-up mushrooms, similar to the new Super Mario Bros. Series games, they're so pointless they feel like a joke. Finding a secret with a 1-up mushroom in Mario Maker is almost like a slap in the face with how pointless it is. Yet, in the NES Mario games, this is a huge deal and a huge reward. You see, that's the point. By setting up the parameters of your game, that being you have limited lives, you can create rewards within these parameters. One of the greatest rewards you can be given is an extra life, which makes exploring for secrets in these games both meaningful and rewarding. You also typically get better at the games by doing this, meaning the game isn't wasting your time, but rather further teaching you how to play the game. To make a comparison to Celeste, which I honestly don't like as much as everyone else seems to, and partially for this reason, in Celeste there are various strawberries you can collect. They're out of the way and difficult to get, but they teach you gameplay mechanics by doing so and help make you better at the game. However, because they're entirely optional and don't reward you in any way whatsoever, they end up feeling completely pointless. As someone who likes going for these types of items in games, I constantly felt so unrewarded that I felt like I was wasting my time and my patience, even if I was improving at the game. However, if you make these secrets feel even somewhat worthwhile, but not mandatory, suddenly they feel extremely rewarding for the people going for them, and that's exactly what a live system allows in games. You don't need extra lives, they're always optional to get, but going out of your way to get them is still a rewarding feeling. To continue this smart design, Super Mario Bros. Also includes coins you can collect. While collecting them feels good because of the noise they make, and collecting in general is a pleasurable thing to do, collecting 100 gives you an extra life. Suddenly, collecting coins are far more rewarding. You could honestly completely get rid of coins in later Mario platforming games for how worthless they are, and you'll have a similar experience. Now, you can use coins to lead players to both secrets and hard to see out of screen areas, which developers often do, but they hold less significance when lives aren't vital to a game. Overall though, this is why Mario Odyssey has its coins allow you to buy outfits as opposed to giving you lives like in the easier new Super Mario Bros. Games, because that gives them some meaning and sense of purpose. While Mario Bros. Is the easy example, other games, such as Megaman, were also smart in their use of extra lives and use them as a reward.
Conversely, checkpoints can also feel meaningless if they're too close together or there isn't any punishment for death. A lot of modern games suffer from this, by simply not challenging the player and becoming boring in a different way.
I mean, I guess you sort of get it then?
Inherently, it's less fun to go through the same section you've already beaten countless times before. Of course, you get better with each attempt and can complete it faster or without losing as many lives.
What you just described there is fun for some people, and while it might not be fun for you, that's the appeal of it, that it's a challenge you can eventually master.
But when you fill your later levels with insane reflex challenges and cheap deaths, or wear down the player without any respite, it piles a walk of shame on top of your failure, making you go back through the easy peasy levels you've already conquered so many times.
Oh, might not want to use Megaman 2, where you can use Flashman to stop time and easily go through this section as your example here. Also, the beginning of the cave in Castlevania is the devil. Might want to watch what B-roll you use in these segments.
When you reach a certain checkpoint, knowing there won't be any way your progress will be reset, it makes that checkpoint so much more rewarding, like a bonfire in Dark Souls. This is your new starting place. It builds on your previous accomplishments and just adds more. No one step forward, two steps back nonsense. I beat Super Mario Bros. 3 for the first time on stream the other night, and man, it was super rewarding. I warped straight to World 8, and yeah, it was hard, but still felt beatable. I remember thinking there's no way you would see stages like these in Mario games today. It really puts your skills to the test. That Bowser fight was top-notch, but they also did a decent job of balancing punishment and leniency. Upon a game over, you start at the beginning of the world, but any airships or tanks are destroyed for good, so you don't have to play those levels again. And while you can randomly get sucked into the abyss by these omniscient hands, they actually are more helpful than harmful, since the stages are very short and reward you with a valuable leaf power-up. The only parts you'd have to play again after restarting are level 1 and 2, but after completing the fortress, it sets a new permanent checkpoint leading straight toward Bowser's castle. But even then, I found myself using save states after finishing certain stages, because in the interest of time, I didn't want to keep playing the same challenges I had already overcome. I probably would have stopped before finishing if I had to keep fighting through level 1 and 2 so many times. Not out of lack of ability, but boredom or annoyance. I think this is why most virtual consoles have a save state function built in nowadays.
Okay, this is a juicy one. So let's talk Super Mario Bros. 3, one of the greatest platform games ever designed, still to this day. When you skip to World 8 immediately, there's a few things you might miss. So as games typically do, Mario 3 ramps up in difficulty, teaching you important elements of gameplay throughout the entirety of the game. Not just in World 1, but many worlds after that. You'll also obtain important items, which the game tells you how to use in a letter from Peach. One of these is that the P is powerful, which you'll learn is important to save only for extenuating circumstances as it's so powerful. Essentially, it gives you the power to indefinitely fly until you finish a level. Another one is the Cloud power-up, which lets you skip difficult stages entirely that you're struggling with. But one of the most important things you'll gain, as this is a lives-based game, are those lives. Skipping to World 8 is considered super challenging for the important reason of you're not gonna have all the resources you'd otherwise have if you played the game normally. It's like playing a JRPG and going to the final boss right away and then complaining that it's hard. Or, to make a modern platform comparison, playing the intro stage to Shovel Knight and then just skipping to the final stage. What made these games fun was learning how to play these games and building on your skills as you worked your way through various challenges that slowly ramp up. By the time you get to World 8, you should naturally be an expert at Super Mario Bros. 3. You'll also come equipped with all of the lives you've earned so far and all of the items you've picked up along the way that can help out with particularly challenging stages. Being able to jump to the final stage right off the bat is fun, because it's a secret. You're not supposed to find these whistles right away, but playing into the gameplay of Super Mario 3, the game teaches you to explore levels. You'll find coins which add extra lives. You'll find extra lives which add to your lives. You'll also find power-ups which make your character stronger. You'll sometimes find treasure, giving you items you can use at any time. On top of all of that, you might even find super secret whistles that allow you to entirely skip worlds. If you discover these, and you're struggling early on in the game, use these to skip a world you might be struggling with, but go to one of the later worlds at your own risk and peril. As for save states on NES emulators go, yes, it takes away from the challenge for people who want that, and because modern gaming caters around appealing to everyone and not just the hardcore. But one of the major reasons for this should be pretty obvious. Up until The Legend of Zelda, the technology to save in cartridge-based games hadn't been invented yet. And even in Zelda, the cartridge used a battery to do this, which often failed, so many games still didn't implement it. So being able to save your progress was usually either impossible, took up too much hardware and or software real estate, or didn't function very well, so games attempted to work around it. Luckily, with new technology, that's no longer an issue, so you can save your game.
But there's more at work here causing such frustrating experiences. If purely restarting from further back was the issue, games like Bloodborne would not be as popular as they are. I think it comes down to enemy placement and level layouts. Developers used to be a lot more carefree with incorporating random elements into their games than they are now. Look at how the zombies pop up out of the ground in Ghosts and Goblins. It's like, hey, sorry you got hit, that's the nature of the game, baby. Sometimes they'll randomly chomp your legs off. So many NES games feel like gauntlets just littered with enemies. No rhyme or reason to their placement. Telegraphing incoming danger is so vital to how a player feels when encountering obstacles. It's the difference between feeling clever and like you read the enemy's mind, and feeling blindsided, like you were cheated out of a life.
Here's an excerpt from an Akira Kitamura interview, the creator and designer of the original Megaman games, translated by shmuplations.com. And also, as a note, he's talking about designing Mega Man 1 and to an extent Mega Man 2, so still really early on in the NES's life cycle. I joined Capcom as a graphic designer, but very quickly I became seduced by the lure of design, so I requested a transfer to the planning team. After a period of study and working on various projects, the Mega Man development began. But as I thought about game design then, I started to wonder if designers had really thought deeply about enemy placement and behavior. I'm sure you've experienced this before, Ariga, but in an action game or platformer, there's often that one part in the stage where you always die, right? And quite often in those parts, it's the way that enemies act that's totally unfair and absurd, don't you think? In fact, no matter what game, it's those difficulty spikes that become the bottlenecks for players and leave them with the impression that the game was too hard. And yet, at the same time, it's a fact that those tough parts also compromise some of the core gameplay in any game. Going through all those games taught me something important though. I started to think that if I focused on more detailed, intricate enemy behavior and placement, then I could probably achieve a better difficulty balance than what action games had offered so far. I also created some rules for myself about enemy placement and design. Number 1, single weak little enemies would appear in waves of 3 or 4 individuals, and to the extent possible, I'd avoid mixing up multiple enemies. Number 2, they would all use the same attacks. Number 3, I would use the differences in terrain and enemy placement to adjust the difficulty of a given section. Number 4, the difficulty of each enemy in the wave would gradually rise, but the last enemy to appear would be easier. So, there you have it! Mega Man was one such game where enemy placement and level layout was taken into huge consideration. The enemies were supposed to appear in a pattern where you first learned how to fight them in an easy way, then the challenge would be shifted when you encounter them again. Maybe it would be platforming that made them harder, or more enemies, but you always learned how to deal with them first in an easy manner. And Megaman wasn't the only game to do this, it just happened to be the one where I have a great quote from the creator of the game offhand.
But the level design often doesn't help the situation either. Bottomless Pits and one-hit KOs are all over 8-bit titles, and most of the time they're combined with annoying enemies to make it even harder to avoid your demise.
One-hit KOs were put there on purpose to up the challenge. It's the exact same thing as a bottomless pit. The example that's shown here in Mega Man 2 was to add a new challenge where you have to watch how high you jump. I think it's a pretty fun segment, personally, and you have plenty of time to test how jumping works in water before you get here. It's not just thrown at you. Now, I want to stress, if you didn't like these segments, that is fine. As I said, I personally enjoy them, but either way, that's not indicative of good or bad game design. What matters is how it's implemented and if it accomplishes its task.
Add in faulty physics or committed jump arcs, and sometimes your strategy feels more like luck than actual planning.
Whoa! Hold up a second. The entire purpose of having a committed jump arc is so you're required to plan your actions. That's why people like the NES Castlevania games. You have to be extremely precise and smart about what you do, otherwise you'll be punished. You can't just rely on a quick reflex to save you if you made a poor decision. That's not luck and is 100% planning.
And finally, this is less of a big deal, but visually speaking, NES games look old and gross. And what is that supposed to be?
Well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. While you can showcase the worst examples, personally I think a lot of NES games look charming. Obviously games look better as graphics improved, but sometimes simplicity can be really endearing, and limitations actually help add to creativity. Also, it doesn't really matter for the design of the game, so it's kind of irrelevant.
It's pretty hilarious when you realize games used to just release with this little polish. Glitching pixels and tons of lag were par for the course. Bethesda ain't got nothing on this.
Yeah, that's just being on limited hardware. Again, it doesn't reflect on game design. And some of the things these guys figured out were absolutely brilliant. Like in Super Mario Bros., the clouds and plants are the exact same sprite but with different colors. I never noticed this until it was pointed out to me, but they had to do this because of the limitations of the time. And the workarounds they found were often so smart that I don't understand how you could complain about them if you knew just what they were working with.
Obviously, games have come a long way since then, and creators had to work with the tech of the time.
See? You get it?
Let's look at Shovel Knight, perhaps the prime example of what a tribute to the NES era should look like. It perfectly shows us that you can still have a challenging adventure while also feeling fair. Enemies will always give you enough time to react to their behavior, and often are introduced in a safe environment the first time you see them.
Man, that sure sounds familiar. I can't, for the life of me, remember why though.
Telegraphs are aplenty, especially for the big baddies and bosses, though obstacles are the same way. There's almost never a time where you'll be caught off guard or killed cheaply as long as you're paying attention. See, while there are flying Medusa heads here too, they don't appear if you're close enough to the edge of the screen. Great safety buffer. And while nasty one-hit KO spikes are bountiful, there's forgiving invincibility frames. So even if you accidentally fall, you have enough time to recover, and even skip past a few obstacles if you're handy. Cycles match up pretty well too, so you can sail through a stage at a normal pace and be fine. And if you do mess up in vertically focused levels, most of the time you'll fall back down to safety and be able to try again right away. Most importantly, you learn how items, objects, and enemies work before it builds in difficulty.
So, most of this segment he goes through and compliments why Shovel Knight is so brilliant, which I agree with. It's an incredibly well-designed game. However, most of the things he talks about were also implemented in NES games and directly inspired by them, so I think he is missing the mark here.
But perhaps coolest of all is how Shovel Knight deals with death and checkpoints. Instead of lives and game overs restarting your progress, you simply lose some of your gold, which can be reclaimed if you make it back to where you previously failed. But if you die again, it's gone for good. A system many other titles have adopted in today's gaming climate. This encourages you to improve without causing a huge detriment to your progress. You only lose roughly 25% of your total money, and makes way more sense than arbitrary lives that serve little to no purpose. Now, there are several different checkpoints throughout a stage, and you have infinite attempts to beat each challenging section. But even better, you can break those checkpoints to gain an extra batch of treasure. But this causes you to restart at an earlier lantern if you die. This introduces an incredible amount of risk versus reward. The reason this works so well is that the player chooses this increase in difficulty. Death is way more punishing, similar to NES games of years past, but you have to opt in to this adjustment, so you have no one to blame but yourself. Shovel Knight doesn't have a difficulty setting, but it builds one in naturally to the world by allowing this choice. And you're really only increasing the amount of time investment required to win. Each stage is still saved after completion no matter what. It's incredible.
So I agree that Shovel Knight is brilliant game design, but it's also a different style. If we look at Megaman again, no matter how many lives you lose, like Shovel Knight, any stage you've cleared remains cleared for good. Not only that, but now is a good time to pull up another quote from Akira Kitamura regarding the design of Mega Man. Also, two of my personal goals for Mega Man were to create a game where all the stages could be cleared in an hour, and to make something that players would want to come back to again and again. To that end, I actually calculated the total number of stages by measuring Mega Man's walking speed and seeing how long it would take to get through each stage. I then split that up so that the first half of the game would be the Robot Master stages, and the second would be the Wily stages. This is an incredibly important thing to take into account with Mega Man games in particular. All the stages are relatively short. They're purposely designed this way. The longer you have to retread through a level if you die, typically the harsher the penalty. However, this is balanced by how hard that challenge is and how much time you have to spend.
The End is Nigh, while not visually similar to NES games, does have huge influence from their difficulty. Much like Super Meat Boy, it's all about shorter increments of platforming, lowering the punishment for failure, but raising the overall brutality. But once you reach the first ending, it kicks things up a notch. Not only do you find yourself in much harder versions of the previous levels, but now you have a certain number of attempts based on how many tumors you've collected along the way. If you run out of tumors, you restart the current area, but you can also go back and explore the rest of the game to try and gather more tumors, which will increase the number of tries you have in the endgame.
Games like Super Meat Boy and The End is Nigh have challenges that far and away surpass anything a game like Mega Man has ever presented. However, because the stages are so extremely short, they can pull it off without being too frustrating. Shovel Knight has stages that are far longer than anything in the NES Mega Man games, which is partially why there's more checkpoints. Mega Man has a checkpoint in each stage, but it only needs one because of how short the stages are. And again, because the stages are shorter than anything in Shovel Knight, while it is frustrating if you die, it wouldn't be nearly the same level of frustrating as dying in Shovel Knight, as the stages are so significantly shorter. The reason I bring up his The End is Nigh example, which he praises, is because Mega Man is essentially right in the middle of The End is Nigh and Shovel Knight. It's slightly more challenging than Shovel Knight, but not as challenging as The End is Nigh. The levels are far shorter than Shovel Knight, but much longer than The End is Nigh. This is how it's balanced. And partially, that's why I wasn't huge on Mega Man 11, as I considered the stages in that to be far too long. But that'll be for another video. So, what have we learned today? Let's recap. Yes, there are good elements in NES games, mainly being able to challenge the player as long as the stages and enemy placement are well designed, and the punishment for death isn't too exhaustive. A game over doesn't have to mean starting from stage 1. You could allow the player to continue, or show a password to return to their furthest accomplishment. But it can go further than that in today's games. If lives don't make sense, try out a different penalty that may still sting, but not cause a player to rage quit in anger, such as a loss of currency, high score, or power-ups. Make your level designs purposeful, and allow the player to learn about an enemy, item, or obstacle before throwing them into the fray. Random elements are obviously allowed, but should be implemented with caution, and tested thoroughly to make sure unjustified deaths are non-existent. And finally, if you want to really elevate the experience, offer an added final test that the player can opt into. So elements here were mentioned that have been implemented ever since Super Mario Bros. 1 that many NES games have pulled from. Learning about enemies, items, and obstacles has been regularly done in platform games since this point. The end of the game was the final test. That's the entire design of the game, where all the elements you've learned so far work together for one major challenge. Also, if lives are your main gripe, that basically means you haven't liked platform games up until Shovel Knight, as pretty much all of them employ lives up until that point. Now look, I won't deny there are some bullshit older games with horrendous design, and there are also modern games which have innovated or come up with new fun concepts. But a lot of people miss old NES games because the games were well-designed challenges. They did an amazing job at teaching you while you play, and they weren't afraid to make you work to finish a game, which added to how rewarding it feels when you finally do. This is important to remember. Not every game has to be for everybody. If a game comes out that I don't particularly enjoy, like Celeste, that doesn't mean it's a bad design or someone else won't enjoy it. Many NES games are more challenging, but also have a well-designed difficulty curve, and making these challenges optional can take away from their fun because it takes away their tension. If you have limited lives in Super Mario Bros., or Mega Man, or Ninja Gaiden, or whatever platform game, the level of tension, risk, and reward are all heightened. And yes, not everyone will enjoy these elements, but for some people, that's part of what makes the experience fun. Of course, there are other brilliant NES games that aren't mentioned here, as it seems to focus on games that are considered NES hard, but I'd like to mention some more just to add some variety and showcase just how strong design was at the time. The Legend of Zelda was created, which, while similar to Atari's Adventure in some ways, was a game that truly spoke to an individual sense of exploration and wonder. Even when I replay it today, I still enjoy it as it feels like exploring and learning a world. If you enjoy Breath of the Wild, the entire game is based off of the first Zelda game and making that experience 3D, as they've discussed in interviews. They even used a 2D NES-style Zelda map creator to help them make the game. Punch-Out! Is another example, where the game is about watching tells from the computer and reacting to them smartly. The tells grow shorter and shorter as the game progresses, with it testing how quickly a player can spot a tell and react. Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy started in this era, and while I do think JRPGs learned a lot since then, as these games rely a lot on grinding, it's still something some gamers enjoy, and grind-style JRPGs still exist and are made today. Contra is supremely challenging, but I've never felt like it was unfair playing it. In fact, I've gotten to the end of the game without the Konami code, and I prefer playing the game that way because it feels more fun. You also have beat-em-up games like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, not 1, which kept on being referenced in that video, which were made more fair for the NES counterparts. There's, of course, Kirby's Adventure, which is the sequel to Kirby's Dream Land, an entire game series made specifically for players who had trouble with games like Mario and Zelda. And then there's DuckTales, which, in my personal experience, I never felt was unfair. I seriously love that game, and it's the game Shovel Knight nicked its main mechanics from. You have Bubble Bobble, which is just a relaxing game to play with friends. You have Metroid, which started the entire Metroidvania design philosophy, with you earning upgrades that allow you to progress to new locations and explore new areas. The game also slowly builds up your character's power, both rewarding you as you explore and making the game easier to handle. There's Iron Tank, which is a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up game at a far slower pace, which creates for a totally unique experience that ramps up in difficulty without getting overly frustrating. I mean, there's just so much good that while yeah, some games are unfair, a lot of these games are games I still replay and have a blast with to this day. There are games, like GoldenEye, which haven't aged well at all, but many NES games are just as playable today, and still just as fun as when they first came out.
The thing is, like, have you sat down and played NES games lately? They kinda suck.
Yes, I have. I actually go back to them a lot because the design of the games still hold up. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Again, I have nothing against Snoman Gaming and think he has some great content. I just felt so passionate about this topic, I felt like I had to make a rebuttal. If you did enjoy this, I'm currently working on a design breakdown of Dark Souls, or you might enjoy my documentary video on the history of the Nintendo and the NES. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.